This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self. Hey, everybody. I could not be more excited for this conversation with my dear friend, Raj Sisodia. If you are not familiar with him, he is the co-founder of Conscious Capitalism. He has written several best-selling books. He is amazing advocate for more human workplaces and that workplaces can be a place that can heal and all about humanity. And more than that, he is a phenomenal human being. And I was so honored a year or so ago when Raj was writing his latest book, Awaken, The Path to Purpose, Inner Peace, and Healing. He had these Sunday morning book clubs with Raj, and there was a small group of us that convened via Zoom, and he would read a chapter to us. And so when the audiobook comes out, you have to get it because to hear Raj tell his own story is like that much even amplified from reading it. But what's so different about this conversation is when I first launched this podcast, I reached out to Raj and said, you need to be on it. And he said, oh, I don't think I would be a fit. Well, with this latest book, he is. And I said, you have to be on here because this is basically his autobiography. And he's telling a story of his life. And you can see how he got shaped and how conscious capitalism was born. But more importantly than that, he talks about the value of sharing our stories. And right off the bat, Carl Rogers, he quotes him by saying, what is most personal is most universal. And we see ourselves in other people's stories. And Raj so courageously and vulnerably and transparently shares his story in this book, but also in this conversation. And I think there's just so many nuggets of wisdom. And he challenges us all to live by the list, LIST. You're going to have to listen for it to find out. And he just challenges us of how we can heal ourselves, but also heal our organizations and heal our world. And so I just loved every second of this conversation. I love this man. I hope you get as much out of this and get his book, support him. Such greatness. Much love for this conversation. All right, Raj, my friend, I am so excited to be spending time with you as always. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with you because I feel like this is going to be a very different conversation than people are used to because this is a very different book. And so I want to just start with why this book, why now? I know you talk about it in the book having a metamorphosis in 2018 and turning 60, but why this book and why now?
Well, I think it was Carl Rogers, who said that which is most personal is most universal. And the reason I decided to share my story, which is a departure for me because in all my books, I've never ever talked about myself. I was always kind of that detached observer, kind of that academic perspective that we tend to take. But then I realized that a couple of things. So, one is the books that have impacted me the most are the ones where the author does share of their own life experiences. That makes it somewhat more compelling. So whether it's Viktor Frankl or Joseph Jaworski or Lynn Twist or many others, I found that those are the books that impacted me the most. And secondly, as you said, in 2018, I was writing the Healing Organization, and I was full steam ahead in my usual mode of research and writing retreats planned for that entire summer to get the book done. And four women told me the same thing. It was Lynn Twist and Nilima, my co-author on Shakti Leadership, and two others. That Raj, you're rushing from project to project and airport to airport. I mean, I really was constantly on the go. And you're writing a book about healing, but what about your own healing? How can you write a book about healing if you haven't worked on your own healing? And I said, well, I don't have time for that. I've got I have a deadline. And I've got the whole summer. They said, you need to take the summer off. I said, no, the whole summer is a series of writing retreats. That's how it's going to get done. They said, no, this is important. We really, really need to slow down and take time. So I listened to them. I had this good sense to listen to them. And I delayed that book by 5 months. And I said yes to a number of experiences that had come up, which I had declined because of this book deadline. So I said yes to going to the Himalayas with the Shakti Leadership Group. Nilima organizes these spiritual journeys around the world. And this one was going to Ladakh, which is a region in the high Himalayas on the border between India and China, Tibet, which is the seat of the deepest Buddhist wisdom in the world. And so that's where I had my 60th birthday, way up, like 20,000 feet. And it was incredible to learn about suffering and to learn about healing from that perspective. I also went to a silent retreat in upstate New York at a place called Peace Village with about 35 other people, including Peter Senge and David Cooper Ryder and others. And in those 4 days of silence, I received so many downloads. It was really an amazing experience, which I highly recommend to anybody. And I started to see things and understand things about my life and about life in general, that was just coming to me. And I had about 45 pages of notes from that silent retreat. I also worked with a coach for the first time, and she gave me some beautiful insights into my life and what my work had really been about. And I also went with Lynn Twist and the Pachamama Alliance to the Amazon rainforest and spent 10 days there in Ecuador, deep inside the rainforest with two different indigenous peoples, immersed in the wisdom of the shamans, the healing rituals and ceremonies that they do, the connection with nature, and that's a big part of why Pachamama exists, to remind us that we don't come into this world, we come out of this world. We are as much a part of nature as a tree or a butterfly, and yet we separate ourselves. And we need to reconnect to really understand our place in the overall scheme of things. And also, a big part of that experience was an ayahuasca journey in the middle of that trip with the shamans. It was an incredible experience to do that with shamans deep inside the rainforest, something that has been done for thousands of years. And I had some amazing insights that came to me through that experience that night about healing and about life as well. So all of these things came together. And I thought I was doing all this in service of the Healing Organization book, but I realized that this doesn't really fit there, that I really want to write about this at length in a separate book. So those were the seeds for this book, which has now come out, called Awaken.
I love that. And one of the things that I was really struck by is when you talk about, that you had these 4 women saying, "Hey, you need to do this, you need to work on yourself." And you talk about something that I think is so unfortunately universal, which is you exude so much love on the outside, and talk about people, you were successful in doing all these things, but you were exhausted and kind of broken on the inside. And I just thought, gosh, you would have never known interacting with you and talking to you hit it well, which so many do. And I just thought, how sadly common is this? I think about I've had experiences like that in my life where I'm right where you talk about us wearing masks and you talk about these trauma stories we have in childhood. And I just think so many people that are extremely, however you define success on the outside, whether it's, they have a lot of friends or they have a good position, are running away from and hiding from this wounded child, whether you had a happy or a traumatic childhood. We all experience trauma and people are running and hiding from it. And I think you're such a great example of sharing the story and the value and the importance of doing the work.
Yeah, and it really was true that some parts of my life had started to fall in place. There was a time, I say, if you go back to before 2004, where I was not happy in any part of my life, nor was I doing anything meaningful, any kind of meaningful work, I would say. I was kind of operating within the traditional academic system, although I really didn't believe in it, the story that I was being told, or the value system that existed there. I was not happy, in my personal life. I had lots of challenges there. I had a deeply troubled relationship with my father, and that had cast a long shadow over a big part of my life, actually. And so I would say I was just, quite miserable in every aspect. No meaning, no purpose, no happiness, no fulfillment. And then at least one part of it started to fall in place with my work starting to connect to my purpose, which I didn't even know I was in that inquiry. But suddenly, when I discovered this way of being in business, right, through in the process of writing Firms of Endearment, because I had been focused on everything that was wrong with business and everything that was wrong with marketing. So I had been following my heartbreak or following my pain, as Andrew Harvey would say, and that had kind of become the basis for much of my academic work, is showing and pointing out all the wrong things that were wrong with business and especially with marketing. And so I was kind of stuck in that negative space. I think there's value in pointing those things out, which other people were ignoring. But ultimately, it wasn't solving the problem, right? It was simply pointing to the problem. And then we started to see the other side of it through firms of endearment, where we found companies that were loved by not only customers, which was our starting point, but by everybody. And they weren't wasting a lot of money on marketing and ads and coupons and junk mail and so forth. They didn't have all the gimmickry that goes with traditional marketing. And there was a whole different mindset and a way of being and a reason for being as a business. And in that process, I connected to my purpose. I was following my heartbreak, but now, in Joseph Campbell's words, I was following my bliss. I discovered, in fact, the signal was so strong and unmistakable because I was literally in tears as I was writing some of the stories of these companies. And I knew, I mean, it's so rare in our lives that we get tears of joy connected to our work. I could not have imagined that until that day, right? I've had anger and frustration and bitterness and all kinds of other negative sentiments, but never tears of joy. And suddenly I said, oh my God, this really matters to me. This really connects to my soul at some deep level that even I didn't know, right? And so I said, I want to dedicate the rest of my life to this story, to understanding it more deeply and then to spreading it in the world. And so the seeds of that next chapter of my life were really planted that day. It was June of 2005, I think. And so that part of my life became deeply meaningful. I found purpose, then I found community. We met John Mackey, we started Conscious Capitalism, and then we had our movement going, and suddenly now all over the country, and now increasingly all over the world, there's communities. I know your tribe exists all over there. So I found community, I found meaning, I found purpose in my work, starting in 2006, 2007, in that time frame. So that was a big part of healing my life, but it was really incomplete because, as I said, at a personal level and at a deeper level in terms of my own healing, I had not looked there at all. I didn't want to look there, right? So there was lots of pain.
Well, and I have to tell you, and I think I've told you this before, but when I found Firms of Endearment, it was like the skies parted and I was like, "Oh my God," and different than you because you were in marketing and pointing all the things out, the things that were wrong, right, and broken, and there's got to be a better way. And while I was at the time in a different field, I was in worksite wellness and worksite health promotion and saying, my God, this stuff is stupid. It doesn't work. It's broken. And you're right. You've got to find a better way. And it was actually in the process of writing our first book that we came upon Firms of Endearment. And I was like, oh my gosh, there are companies that get it, right? If you have a decent culture and you treat your people well and these things converge, then people can at least be whole from a work standpoint. But to your point, there's a whole other healing that has to show up on the personal level. And I think so many people are afraid to do that work because it is unsettling. It is messy. It is deeply uncomfortable and it is deeply vulnerable, but it is so deeply necessary.
Yeah, I know, it's so true. And for me now, I had a way to escape. I didn't want to confront or deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with all of the pain in my personal life. And therefore, I had a refuge now that I could. And I said yes to everything. I was literally on the road. I don't know what percentage, 70, 80% of the time. I was averaging something like 80 to 100 talks a year after that. And I was running towards something, but also running away from something, And I think we tend to do that as human beings. We tend to hide from certain emotional pain. I had a very, very vivid experience of this recently because I was getting back pain, severe back pain for a period of months, and nothing was helping. Massage. I was at an Ayurvedic retreat in India when that started actually, and we were getting like 2 hour hot oil massages every day, and nothing was helping. And then I came to the U.S. and then Mexico for work, and I was there. I was in more agony, and I was getting more massages and chiropractors, and then we went to Costa Rica to Blue Spirit Retreat Center, and I was getting massages over there. And it was just getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, I was so desperate. I was getting injections, muscle relaxant injections, and heavy painkillers, and I was feeling all woozy. I said, "How am I going to go back to work? I don't know how this is going to." I was so desperate. I thought I would have to be admitted into a hospital or something. And then somebody told me that this may be emotional. This most likely is emotional. Is there something that you're not confronting? Is there some emotional thing that you're avoiding? Is there some unexpressed anger, which is a very common thing, repressed anger? And they got me to journal about that. And then I read this book called Healing Back Pain by Dr. John Sarno, The Mind Body Connection. And that most chronic pain, especially back pain, is really rooted in emotional issues. It's nothing to do with structural issues in your body. And no amount of massages or medicines are going to help that. That you really need to understand what that emotional root of it is. And the amazing thing, just by reading that book, my pain went away, as it does for 80, 90% of the people. So the premise, I think, applies more broadly, which is that if you avoid one kind of pain, emotional pain in your life, then your mind will create pain elsewhere. It creates pain in your body to distract you from the emotional pain that you're avoiding. So I think, in a way, I was also avoiding the emotional pain that existed in my life in those years by simply running towards the other stuff. And at some level, that was fulfilling and impactful and all of that, but I was accumulating more pain inside my body as a result of that. So all of that started to come to a head.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me of, and I don't remember who said it, but it was Mark Brackett and Brene Brown were talking on her podcast, and one of them said, "Unfelt and unexplored, unexpressed feelings are not benign. They will metastasize and show up in other places." And I think so many of us, we don't give ourselves permission to feel the cringy stuff or to lean in. And so we numb with food, we numb with work, we numb with liquor. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways we numb, but it's an avoidance and it's gonna show up at some point in time. And I
Oh,
think
yeah.
so much of, what I've been seeing so much with the leaders and the organizations that we work with, obviously everyone's talking about the mental health crisis in our world and our country and just, the cumulative trauma after trauma after trauma over the past 3+ years, and it's taking its toll. But then people are wanting to put band-aids like, oh, let's up our mental health resources, or here, let's put in stress programs, and they're surfacing. And it's not like, are you actually creating a safe environment and equipping people with the right partners and resources to heal wounds that they probably don't realize are there? And I think that's just too scary for some people. And so I feel like you are so well respected and known in the business community, and for you to like put it all out there. I mean, this book is like your autobiography, like
Mhm.
on steroids, and to put it out there for
Mhm.
folks is just amazing. So there was so many times in this book that I was laughing. There were also many times in this book that I was crying. I feel deeply privileged that I got to be part of your Sunday mornings with Raj as you read this to us. So it was really fun to see the final product and how it came together. But tell the story about your father's asthma attack and the shoe, if you would, because I
Mm.
think that this is very reflective of how we create a narrative that we hold on to and we don't even realize it's probably not true.
Yeah, yeah. So I did not know my father until I was about 7 years old. The reason for that is that we were living in a village in India. We came from this big land-owning family, agricultural. My grandfather was kind of the overlord of that village. And my father was a brilliant student, and he was always away in college and then grad school and then to Canada for a PhD. Right? So he was still in college when he got married, which means he was hardly ever in the village. And then he went off to Delhi for his master's, and then he went to Canada for 4 years to get his PhD. So my first memory of him is when he came back to India, and I was about 7. And there was literally a parade that stretched for 50 miles, to welcome him back. It was an enormous thing. Welcome back, Dr. Sisodia. There were banners on the highway every town along the way back to our village from the city. And so I was this little kid from the village, and here's this larger than life figure coming back from this mythical place across the oceans. Remember, this is 1965, right? Very different world. And I was really in awe of him. And he didn't really connect to me or didn't really treat me, I think, the way you would want a small child to be treated. I never remember being picked up or hugged or held or any of that. And so there was this distance between us, and I didn't feel worthy of him. And I suspected that he was, and I believed that he was disappointed in me in terms of I wasn't like him at all. And he would tell me, everything that defined me, all my qualities to him were defects. I was very trusting. He would say, "Don't trust anybody." I was very idealistic. He would say, "Oh, you can't be idealistic. You got to be pragmatic." I was very peace loving, peace harmony loving. He said, "No, you need to be rough and tough." I was very sensitive. He said, "No, you need to have So all of the things wanted me to be the opposite. So I had this deep sort of complex about him. And then we moved to Barbados after that. So we left India and suddenly we were across the world, living in Barbados for 2 years. And I was from the age of 7 to 9. And the incident you're referring to, my father did have asthma and he had to have use this inhaler. And so one a Sunday afternoon, we were in the living room and he was at one end of it, I was at the other end. And he suddenly got an asthma attack, and his inhaler was lying on a little table at the end of the room where I was. And so he was gesturing, and I was just kind of playing around with it. He was gesturing to me to bring that inhaler. He couldn't speak because of the asthma. And I didn't understand. I was just playing and shaking it and pretending that I was going to use it in my. And he got pretty desperate. So he picked up his slipper and threw it at me, and it hit me on the head. I wasn't even looking that direction. And I was just so stunned. And my inner dialogue was, "Oh my God, he hates me. Not only does he think I'm no good, but also, I mean, throwing a shoe at somebody's head is a big thing, in many cultures, right? So that kind of imprinted in my memory for decade. I mean, all my life, really. And the message to me was that he despises me. He doesn't want me as a son. And so I think that is, it's a minor incident, but in the life of a young child with all the backdrop, it's a traumatic imprint on me, and it impacted my behavior and my way of being. From that point forward, I really just became about how can I earn his love, his acceptance. And I recently read about, as part of this whole back pain thing, there's something called the good child, the dangers of the good child. The good child is the one who does everything they're asked to do and is always on time and does their schoolwork and keeps their room tidy and never gets into trouble and doesn't have tantrums. And I was one of those kids. And you think, wow, what an ideal little kid. But actually, that there's something deeply wrong about that, because what that means is you're not actually expressing your emotions. You get angry, you get frustrated, all the things that happen, it's a healthy thing to express. You let your emotions flow through you rather than bottle them up. And that's what I did. And that's what then shows up decades later. As you said, it's all in there, the book, The Body Keeps the Score, by Sylvana. It's all in there, and it shows up later on as this chronic pain and all these other kind of mysterious symptoms that the medical world doesn't know what to do with. But these are some of the things. So there's the issue of a sort of self abandonment, or lack of self expression. You're not being authentic. It's authenticity versus attachment. You so want to attach and belong in that family and be accepted that you lose your authenticity, right? You just become a chameleon and be who you think they want you to be.
In my words, I'm like, "You dull your sparkle so you can you can belong." But you know what, so 1, thank you for sharing that story again, but 2, I think something as simple as you can look at adult, "Oh, duh, he was trying to get your attention because he needed his inhaler," but as a kid, we don't make sense of our experiences that way, and then to hold that story, and one of the things you talk about is the common types of trauma most of us have in childhood. So 1, I'm not enough, which so many of us have. You talk about, "I do not belong," and "I am alone," and I see those at the root of every single person I coach, and one of the things you talk about is like, "Hey, if a memory is sticking with you, for whatever reason, pay attention to it." And I think there's truth in that because one of the exercises we do in immunity to change coaching is we do have people go back and we say the first 15 or so years of your life, if there's a memory that stands out for whatever reason, put it down and you start to see that there's patterns that they might think it's no big deal. Like maybe, you didn't get an A on a test, or maybe you had to take care of your younger siblings, or maybe you had a family member with a health issue. It doesn't really matter. All of these things in our childhood brain that doesn't know how to process them because developmentally we're not there yet, but we create a story and a narrative. And the latest research I saw is that 70% or so of that programming and stories, they're fundamentally flawed, they're negative, and they're self-sabotaging. But that's like our operating system that is running the script in adulthood. It's not our 40, 50, 60-year-old self. It's that 5, 10-year-old version that doesn't feel enough, doesn't feel they belong, feels that they're alone, that is running the show.
Yeah. Yeah. And those wounds, unless they're acknowledged and then worked on, they will remain and they will continue to drive your behavior. When I finally came to the point of reframing that story, I asked my father about it. Of course, he had no memory, just a few years ago. And so, ultimately I realized desperate people do desperate things, right? And doesn't mean that there's a big message behind it. But yeah, and that changes the whole experience of it and the aftermath of it. So very much we have to look at those things. And, with this wounded inner child is, I think, a universal condition for just about everybody. I mean, very few people have childhoods that are devoid of any of those traumas. It varies, of course, a great deal, but I think that unless we heal that, unless we have that healthy child energy within us, we don't have access to joy and playfulness and creativity and laughter and humor and all kinds of great things. So that's I think one of the fundamental things that we have to do is heal those childhood wounds.
100%. Well, and not only do we need to heal them because they are kind of running and hijacking our story, in the absence of data or in the absence of being able to check out the validity of our story, like you were with your dad, our brains fill it in. So, right in the absence of data, oh, running the story, my dad hates me. No, he needed to
Yeah.
get your attention because he needed an asthma inhaler. But how often do
Yeah.
we not have the opportunity to check out our stories or for whatever reason, or we don't check them out, and then we just run as if that's true. It's heartbreaking, really, and it's such a universal thing. So, with that, tell me about, I know you love your acronyms. And one of the things that you talk about is how we are both the source of our own suffering, but we're also the source of our own healing. And you came up with this acronym list. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and how it comes into the picture?
Yeah, and so this one I don't think I came up with. I think it came to me. I suppose all things come to us from some mysterious place, but this particular one was during the ayahuasca experience that I had in Ecuador, where I had gone there to learn about healing. And my entire night, all the messages I got were about healing. And and one of them, before I get to list, was what you were just talking about. So I was shown a vision of a long line of people standing under the hot sun, waiting to get a hug from a woman, a tiny woman at the end of the line, right? And I recognized her as Amma, who is known as the hugging saint from India, who travels all over the world, and people stand literally for 12 hours until they get a hug from her and they walk away in tears, having experienced unconditional love from this stranger, really. And she doesn't even speak English, really. But there's a deep craving and hunger there. And the message I got was that all these people standing in line, they don't have to wait, they could be hugging each other. That we are the source of suffering for ourselves, as you said, but also for each other. Most suffering on this planet is inflicted by humans on other humans and on other life forms. But we are also the source of healing for each other, and that every one of us can play that role. Every human being carries within them that energy to heal or to inflict suffering. So that was an important message I felt I got that night. But the biggest message was I started to see these words floating in my vision. So remember, picture this, that I'm lying with my eyes covered on banana leaves under the sky. It was a lunar eclipse night that night in Ecuador. It was June 12th, I think, of 2018. And I had gone through this shamanic experience all day, a hike and a sacred waterfall, cleansing, and then back to the shaman settlement, and then having these series of visions. And so this one, it's like you're lying there and there's somebody speaking to you and they're saying, okay, this is what the world needs in order to heal. Okay, and these four letters floated into my vision. It's LIST. This is the list. And this is what business needs in order to heal, and this is what people need in order to heal. And then the four things started to come into focus one by one. So the first was love, that everything we do should come from a place of love. Every single action that we do, even the hardest and the harshest thing that sometimes we're called upon to do, right? Whether you have to let somebody go or whether you have to pull the plug on somebody who's in the hospital, whatever it might be, can you do it from love? And not anger and not fear and not greed. Think about how many business decisions are rooted in fear and greed as opposed to love, right? And so every single action should come from love. So that is the fundamental human quality, it's the fundamental energy of the universe. And it was a reinforcing of a message I had received before, because when I started writing the healing organization and we ordered Chinese food one day, and the fortune cookie literally said there are many ways in which you can hurt, but there's only one way to heal, and that is through love. So this was a real reminder of that fundamental truth. So L is for love. The second was I for innocence. And the message was that we are all born innocent. And then we gradually get impacted and, in a way, corrupted by the ways of the world, right? By what we see and what we are told and what we learn and how we emulate others around us. And we don't really have a choice because we are just sponges soaking up what's around us and we don't have any discernment. But we do have the ability to choose when we become adults. We can choose to return to innocence. What does that mean? That means you're not guilty of knowingly causing harm or suffering towards another. Unnecessary suffering. There's some necessary suffering in the world that we can't prevent, and some of that suffering can serve a higher purpose. But there's a lot of unnecessary suffering in the world, whether it's wars or even in business. Can we not be an instrument of suffering towards others? Strive to live with that level of innocence. And I think that is the fundamental way we come into this world in a way kind of pure. Can we reclaim that innocence as a strong adult? Not the helpless innocence of a child, but the chosen innocence of a strong adult. That I choose to live this way. The third was simplicity. We have these incredibly rich minds, and we are able to delve into levels of complexity, but sometimes we get lost in that complexity. And the reminder here was that the most important fundamental things in life are simple. And don't lose sight of that simplicity even as we're dealing in complexity, right? It's what Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. called the simplicity on the other side of complexity. He said, I would not give a fig for the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I will give my life for the simplicity on the other side, which comes with true understanding, with mastery, right? How do we live in that space of deep simplicity? And then the last was the truth. What is our commitment to the truth? Truth is fundamental. Without truth, there cannot be any peace. Truth matters even more than peace. Think about South Africa at the end of apartheid. They had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Without the truth, there can be no reconciliation until we acknowledge what happened in those hundreds of years of apartheid, the amount of suffering that was inflicted. Then we can move towards reconciliation, right? Atonement, begging forgiveness, etc. But you cannot move forward. You cannot heal the future and the present until you heal the past. And that means bringing the truth. So, what is our commitment to the truth in business and in life? And so, this was to me, a very powerful message that came through me, that these are fundamental things. If we can strive to live by the list, that would change everything. If we can do that in business, if we can do that in politics, in our personal lives, that would completely change our lived experience.
I love that, and no pun intended since the L is love, but I think you're right because I think about just how much divisiveness there is in our society right now. And I think a lot of it is there's not love, it's rallying around hate. And rather than
Mhm.
leaning in to get to know people or be curious, it's someone's different than me, or there's some story that I believe, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on. And it's so rooted in hate for the other side or hate for someone who's different than us. And then truth, like we don't want to speak the truth. We don't, it's too hard or too painful or too scary to look at the roots of some of the stuff that's gone on in our society and our country. And I think that it's sad because it's just getting worse. And then businesses are forced to kind of deal with it because it trickles over. We're not in a bubble. And we're whole people. We bring our personal lives into work, whether we physically go into a workplace or not, and our work lives trickle over to home. And I think there's just so much unrest and again, this constant stream of crises that it's so necessary. And I think what a difference it would make if we could start doing that.
Yeah, and it really impacted me in my personal life very directly as well, because I have a special needs son. He was 33 years old now. He was fine until he was about 3, but then he started getting diagnosed with, the diagnosis really took a long time, but he started exhibiting certain symptoms and gradually became worse and worse and became pretty severe after he was 10, 11 years old and required multiple hospitalizations. And there were many, many, rather traumatic things, even for us, I can imagine for him. And so life was very difficult. Anybody with special needs children will know understand that. And so, it kind of consumes your attention in your life and kind of creates a feeling of heaviness and a sense of hopelessness because these are chronic, lifelong conditions and it impacts us and the family in every way. And so I started to view him unconsciously as kind of a burden, as a responsibility, as something I have to provide for him his entire life. I can't look forward to all of the joyful things about graduations and getting married and having grandchildren and all of those things. So kind of this is the thing playing subconsciously in your mind. So I did my duty for him, but I didn't really see him as a whole person. I just saw him as a responsibility and a burden in a way, and that he was in a way holding me back. And so two things happened in the course of writing this book. So one was I have a chapter in there which we can talk about called Healing the Father Wound. So that was a big one for me. And I wrote about that. And one day I sat up with the start and I said, oh my God, my son also has a father wound
Mm.
because of me. That my father did not accept me or see me for who I was because I was so different from him. And I really didn't accept my son or see him for who he is because he's so different from me. Right. And he's got his own father wound as a result of our relationship. And so that was a bit of a shock. And I said, wow, how can I change that now? And then the other thing was that Neha, my partner, one day, and she knows him pretty well, she said to me, do you realize that your son is the list? He embodies all four of those things. He's incredibly loving and affectionate at all times. He's innocent like a young child. He keeps life very simple. If he has his basic things, then he's the happiest person in the house. And he cannot tell a lie. He's incapable of telling a lie. And so here's somebody who's a living embodiment of this thing that we're saying we all need to strive towards. I said, oh my God. So this just became such a transformational thing with those two realizations, and it has changed my relationship with him, changed the quality of time that we spend together, how much pleasure and joy that brings now, and I can see him blossoming under that new relationship as well. And such a gift, I can't even put words or put a value on that, so it's been an incredible gift.
Well, and one of the things that you write in the book when you're talking about healing the father wound, and you say, "I realize now that my father carried within him a deeply wounded inner child who had experienced severe trauma that was never processed." And if you think about that, we do the best that we can. Again, you were working on your own healing, and even if somebody had a happy childhood, like, people are doing the best that they can. And I think that it's so easy to stand in judgment of, well, someone should want better or should be able to do better or should be different than they are, rather than seeing them for who they are, like flaws and all. Like, was it the Avatar movie? They say, I see you. But I love that you're like, when you decided to see your son, like, what opens up and what a gift. I just think if we started seeing people rather than our ideas about them or who we think they could be or should be, can we just see people and let them be who the heck they are so we don't have to run around exhausted wearing all these masks?
Yeah, I know it's true. And for in my case, with my father, it wasn't just what we talked about earlier with the slipper and all that, but there were some pretty traumatic incidents that happened when I was in my 20s and I wanted to get married to somebody I met. And I thought he was a highly educated, brilliant scientist who had lived all over the world. And this would not be a big deal because I do come from a culture where arranged marriage is the norm. And if you look for somebody within your specific community and so forth. But that's what he insisted on. And he immediately said, no, you must choose between her or us. If you go this road, then you're dead to us. It was literally that stark and that harsh. And when I didn't give in, then he said, well, if you marry, I curse your marriage. And then he threatened to kill himself. That was traumatic. And he cut himself with a knife. I gave in for a while, but then I said, no, I cannot let him dictate my life like this. This is my life. And then finally, the last straw was that when I told him I am going to go ahead with this, he literally pulled out a gun and said something like, I would rather not have a son than have a son like this. And that was so traumatic that I actually erased that memory. There's something called dissociative amnesia, that my mind, in order to protect my psyche and my being, basically erased that memory for 30 years. I just found out about it in 2019 from my cousin, where he painted the scene. He was in the room at the time. And so I had all these traumas with him, and I was 5 years estranged from him after I got married. There was no communication. He didn't acknowledge the birth of my son. He had cursed our marriage, and our son turns out to be special needs later. And my wife said, oh, that's your father's curse. So there was all this anger and bitterness that I had. My entire life was lived under a dark cloud in those years. I felt like I had been cut off, like a phantom limb from my family. I was very close to my extended family. And so I out here in an island by myself in a way, and affected our marriage too. You talk about being blessed by your parents as part of when you get married, but this is an unblessed, not even unblessed, it's a cursed marriage by not my mother. My mother is, different, but my father did that. So I had this anger and bitterness, and then I came to a place of forgiveness. And it really came from Tuesdays with Maury, that book, and then the movie where he asked Maury, what's the one piece of advice you would give? He said, if I could live life again, I would forgive everyone for everything. And I said, okay, let me do that. So in my mind, I said, okay, I forgive him. But without really understanding deeper than that, right? I'm just like forgiving him. So that's not real forgiveness, right? And then I took an art of living course, which is one of those spiritual courses out of India. That's the first time I had a spiritual experience, really. This 5-day course, it was rooted in some very basic, practical wisdom. And one of those is acceptance. You just accept people for who they are. And they do what they do, and they don't do what they don't do, and they say what they say, and all of it is what it is when you don't know why. And there are 1,000 and more reasons why people are the way they are, and they act the way they are, their upbringing and their circumstances. So acceptance as a place beyond forgiveness. And I said, is it the same thing? I said, no, forgiveness means you're right and somebody else is wrong. Acceptance simply means I don't understand, but it is what it is. So I said, okay, I accept. But, even that wasn't deep enough. So over time, and this took 30 years, I went from anger, bitterness, forgiveness, acceptance to understanding, slowly understanding. Why did this brilliant, educated man suddenly come back to his roots and become invested in that again? And then I started to move towards empathy and finally compassion. I realized that we're all victims of victims. His father was a very even harsher patriarch. He would cut him off multiple. I was cut off for once for 5 years. My grandfather would cut him off many times. Every time he did something, he's like, "You're dead to me. Oh, I don't want anything to do with you." And my father gave in to my grandfather when it came to question of who to marry. He liked somebody else, but then my grandfather found out and immediately arranged his marriage. He wanted to be a doctor, but my grandfather wouldn't allow that, so he forced him to study agriculture instead because we had all this land. So my father gave up his professional dream, his personal, in service of the so-called greater good of the family. So his father was harder than him, and then so when it came time for him to impose the same kind of things on his son, he kind of said, "Well, I had to do that, so why not? Why not you?" So he would call me selfish. He said, "You only care about yourself. You don't care about the family." So I came to that place, and ultimately I realized that he had kind of sacrificed his career and his life. It's came back to India because of his father, and he gave up his scientific career. And he had so much potential. He could have won a Nobel Prize. He was that brilliant, in agriculture. And he wanted to cure world hunger and all these dreams. And then, of course, I realized there was a deep wound that was sitting in our family, a trauma that happened, which I wasn't aware of until 2019 as well. That was impacting not only my family, but the extended family, my father's, all of his siblings and his father and all of that. So there was an incident about 75 years ago, which was pretty dark incident. It was a kind of honor killing that happened within the family, and two people were killed to protect the honor of the family. And that's why honor became the biggest thing now, right? Protecting the honor it's all about that. He said to me, "I won't let you destroy the good name of our family because you're doing this thing, marrying somebody outside the faith or outside the culture." And he was a witness to that atrocity, couldn't do anything to stop it. I don't know if he tried. And then it was sworn to secrecy for the rest of his life. You couldn't talk about it. These two lives were erased. It's like they never existed. And that trauma was unhealed inside him. One of the things we've come to realize about trauma is you have to reveal it and feel it in order to heal it. If you hide it, as he did, you conceal it, and then all you can do is numb it. So he drank heavily every single day of his life to find some joy and some peace. And the only time I would see him laugh and smile would be after a few drinks. And then he would have to take sleeping pills in order to fall asleep, to get any peace. He had no peace of mind at all for his entire life. So I came to this place of deep empathy and compassion. And I said, my God, that was a tortured life that he led. And he had no spiritual dimension at all. He was so much in his head. So, yeah, that was kind of the arc. And then for me, the choice is very clear. This is a cycle of victims goes back at least 4 or 5 generations in my family that I know of, right? Fathers, all father wounds coming down, right? And I said, well, that cycle needs to end with me now that I've come to these realizations, right? So how can I stop that from happening? How can I not have my son be a victim of that, or my daughters as well, right? So that was a big part of it. And then the other part of it really was healing not only myself for my personal traumas, but then the collective trauma of my family, right? So we did a healing ceremony in India last year when I went, and we gathered the entire extended. That's the epilogue of the book. That's kind of the closure. Because if I put all this out, these traumatic things that happened, and yet there's no healing from it, then there has to be some meaning. You got to find some. The only way to find meaning in it is to heal it, or try to heal it. So we did that kind of a ceremony. We acknowledged the truth of what had happened 75 years ago, even though none of us personally were involved, but it happened in our system, in our family. We're all being impacted by it. We collectively beg forgiveness for what happened. We honor the memory of those who were lost, who were killed, and now start to move into the future with a fresh commitment to what is our dharma. What are we supposed to be in this world, in this lifetime, right? Given the privilege and all of the wealth, etc., that relatively speaking, our family was given, we were really abusing that. People were not only taking it for granted, they were abusing people instead of we're supposed to be the protectors. I come from this warrior caste. The dharma of the Rajputs is to be the protectors and defenders of the people, to sacrifice yourself to save the people. We were damaging and destroying other people's lives just to benefit ourselves. That was happening in our family. So that's the healing that can result, when you look at these things. When I learned of these things, some people in my family said, well, you can never talk about this. This is not okay. These things used to happen in the old days and people will laugh at us. I said, no, I will not be part of the conspiracy of silence around this. This truth has to come out.
I so love that you did that. I remember when we were doing the book readings and you were talking, maybe I'm going to do that. And we're like, oh my gosh. So to see that that happened is just like, is, is so powerful. And there's something that if you're okay with it, I remember you reading this to us and when I read it again, it brought tears in my eyes. But I think there's one thing about healing wounds and speaking truth to it because shame likes silence, right? So when we put stuff out there, but there's also something to be said for, I know Brene Brown always talks about how joy is also one of our most vulnerable emotions. And so often we don't express stuff or we assume people know or it feels weird. And so your coach, so you talk about healing your father wound and then you talk about honoring your mother because so much of you and so much of your nurture and love comes from her, right? That you thought was a liability in your father's eyes. And you had a coach that bugged you and said, you have to call her. And so, can I read? It's just like a small passage. You called her and you said, I said, Mummy, I called you to tell you how much you have meant to me in my life. Everything that I have done in the world that has mattered, everything that has touched people and impacted their lives is because of you. It is because of what I learned from you. You live your life with so much love and gentleness. You have taken such loving care for us our entire lives. I feel so blessed and am so grateful to have you as my mother. Mommy started crying. She said between sobs, I am nothing, Raj. I am nothing. This brought on my own tears. I am crying now as I write this. No, Mommy, please don't say that. That is just not true. You are everything. Ever since she became a wife and mother, my mom thought of herself as less than. Her father had only educated her until the 8th grade, and she didn't speak English, while my father was a gold medal winning scientist with a PhD. I am just a simple, uneducated woman. I am blessed to have a son like you. I am so proud of you. Every mother should have a son like you, she told me. Mommy, most of what is good in me comes from you. What the world needs is what you've taught us and shown us. You have such an enormous heart, and you never knowingly hurt anyone. I don't remember a single time you got angry or said anything harsh to me or to anyone else. If you hadn't loved us the way you did, I don't know if I could have survived in the world. And so, is it fair to say that we can thank your mom, Usha, for really conscious capitalism?
Yes, I believe. Yes, and Usha means the light, by the way. And yeah, she was the purest soul that I've ever met, I have to say. She was as innocent when she died at 82 as she was when she was 3. She lost her mother when she was 5 years old. This little gentle soul. And all she did was love unconditionally. And my coach gave me that beautiful gift that you mentioned, right? She said, after hearing the story of my life, she said, you realize you spent 45 years trying to impress your father. And now you spend the last 15 honoring your mother with your work, right? And it was such a brilliant insight, but also a beautiful gift because she made me call. And one of the things that I received on a planned journey, so I've done other planned journeys too. The ayahuasca was so powerful. I said, wow, this gives me access to planes of consciousness that I otherwise don't, and access to some beautiful wisdom that comes through. And one of those was that love that is not expressed is like a check that is never cashed. It doesn't do any good for anybody. I could write $1 million check to somebody and they don't cash it. I want to give and they don't. There's no impact, right? And so we bottle up all these feelings. We don't express them. I, like so many of us, took my mother somewhat for granted, and we run after our father's path in the world. And this is something we need to change. We should not take that for granted, and we should express those feelings. We should cash those checks. We should make sure that those things people know how we feel. So I get people literally in the spot in some of the workshops to sit down right now and write a note and send it before the end of the day. And but then what I've also come to realize over time, and that's kind of where the book ends up, is that my father was an embodiment of masculine energy. He had healthy masculine energy early in his life, but then he had zero feminine side. Because why? Because his mother died. His mother was a very meek and cowed woman, and his father probably beat her and all that. So he had no feminine influence in his life growing up. Didn't have. I had a loving mother. He had kind of an absent mother, and so he had no feminine energy whatsoever. And in the absence of that, the masculine becomes abusive, becomes toxic, becomes hyper masculine, right? Domination, aggression, etc. All those things. He had great personal power and charisma. He had a large personality. He impacted people's lives. So he came with great personal power, but no love. And then you have my mother who came with pure love, unconditional love, but she was not in her personal power. She could not say no. She could not stand up to my father when he did things that caused so much pain and suffering to his own kids. She could have stood up and said, "No, you cannot cut my son off. I'm going to go to his wedding." I know she wanted to, right? But she didn't have the power. So here's a disempowered love, and here is power with no love on the other side, right? And we don't have to choose. And I think for all of us, we should strive to combine those two things. Yeah, you must be rooted in love, but make sure you cultivate your personal power as well, because that empowers that love to actually have a positive impact, a bigger positive impact on the world than otherwise it would. It still will have an impact, but nowhere near what could happen if you empower that. So, how do we cultivate personal power? Right? Sense of integrity, sense of boundary, sense of knowing who you are, what your values are, your purpose are, and combine that with love. And that's what I believe I'm going to strive to do, is to blend the healthy aspects of both my parents. Right? Because they were too focused on one side, they were experiencing the downside of that as well.
One of the things I also love that you've put in this book is while you're so generously and transparently and vulnerably sharing your story, you're giving people questions of, okay, think about how does this apply to your life? Or have you ever experienced this to really have this be a journey that while you're sharing yours, people can go through for themselves and reflect on what is something that you are hoping overall people are going to take away from this book?
To me, the ultimate message of this book is to heal yourself, find out what needs healing, what are your wounds and traumas, and work on that. And healing also implies wholeness. So that means the masculine, feminine, making sure that you've got healthy versions of both energies in you. And we talk about the elder and the child as well, right? Become the wise fool of tough love. The wisdom of the elder, the joy and playfulness of the healthy child, the strength of the father and the love of the mother, all of that within one being. So heal yourself, become whole, and live by the list. Filter everything you do in life through the list. Say, am I acting from love? Am I knowingly causing harm here and pain, inflicting suffering? Am I losing sight of what really matters? And is this the truth? Am I hiding behind something else? I think to me that if I can, and again, all of this applies to me, if I can live up to that, that would make a huge difference in my life, but all the lives I touch.
So, I want to ask you a question that I ask all of my guests, and I know that you've shared so much of this in your book and while you're on your journey to healing. Is there still, throughout all of this, a self limiting story that pops up for yourself today from time to time? And if so, what is it? And what do you do when it shows up so that you can still live by the list and show up as a leader in your life?
Yeah, so I think what happened in the last few months, and I'm still not fully over it, but the pain that I experienced and understanding now at a deep level the mind body connection, and that my psyche is still carrying certain wounds and some limitations. So that self expression, don't feel I'm fully there yet. Being able to express emotions and not censor them, right, in a healthy way. You have to be able to express anger. You have to be able to set boundaries, say no. All of those things still don't come naturally to me, and therefore I'm still to this day dealing with those kinds of pains. But it's the realization, once you know better, then you do better, right? So now I'm actively processing every time I'm feeling some twinge in my back today. And every time you do that, you say, is it psychological, not physical? The answer, usually it is psychological. I didn't do anything to strain my back, and yet, why is it happening? So yeah, there's something going on in my psyche. So it's always that holding that mirror, it's what Neha calls becoming a self-cleaning oven.
I love that. I love how she
So
puts stuff. It's awesome.
just because you clean it up once doesn't mean you're done. And this is a lifelong journey. This healing is not doesn't ever end.
It
There's
is.
always deeper layers to get to. So yeah, I think for me that is it's that authenticity versus attachment and not giving up one for the other.
Love
Not
it.
willing to not be yourself so that people will like you or people will accept you. No, you have to be yourself and work on yourself, evolve yourself at the same time.
I love it. All right. Are you ready for quick questions?
Sure.
Okay. You already kind of answered the first one, but that's okay. Fill in the blank. Living authentically is.
Being true to yourself at all times.
Love it. When the world is presenting an opening, but you don't feel like showing up as a leader, what do you do?
We have to recognize that life is always about growth versus safety. Every time you're faced with an opportunity or a challenge, it's growth. You can choose the path of growth or you can choose the path of safety. Now, sometimes you should choose safety because there are things that are not worth the risks. But if we always choose safety, then we'll never grow. And if we stop growing, then we really start dying. So I think choosing the path of growth is important to make sure that we often enough choose growth over safety.
100%. I love that. What is something people would be surprised to know about you?
Well, I don't know if it comes across, but I love humor. I love comedy, humor writers. I also love music. I love singing. I'm not that good at it. My sister and my brother are better singers, but I just love it.
You're a
So
stellar Zumba dancer too. Come on. Y'all,
yeah, I got to
anyone
have
listening,
everybody.
man, Raj doing Zumba with me is like the best
Everybody
thing
should
ever.
experience a Zumba class with Rosie. I recommend that to all the listeners someday. Do some Zoom Zumba. We'll all join in.
It's fantastic. All right. What is your favorite go to movie?
My Fair Lady.
Mm,
That's the movie I've seen maybe 8 or 10 times. I haven't seen any other movie more than twice, I think. But My Fair Lady, there's just something about it that just speaks to me.
nice.
The music, the acting, the humor, the writing is just beautifully written.
That's awesome. All right. What's your go to song?
In English, it's Imagine, John Lennon. And in Hindi, of course, I have other songs.
Love it. Love it. What is something you can't live without?
Books.
That makes sense. What is something in your ordinary daily life that makes your heart happy?
Oh, watching a nice movie or a nice show, with Neha. I mean, just, it's a nice way to end the day.
I love that for you guys. And what are you grateful for right now?
I'm grateful to have this conversation with you and for this opportunity to bring this message of healing to the world, to use my life as a canvas to help others, to not have to go through the same kind of suffering and to be able to get to healing quicker.
Well, I will say we are all grateful for that as well. So, one closing question, Raj. If you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
Well, I would say it would be to release two things from the corporate closet. I talk about there's silent suffering and there is unexpressed love. So, as a leader, express your love and be willing to share how you are suffering or how you have suffered. That will humanize you and it'll give permission for others to do the same. And it'll create deeper levels of connection and it'll create a cascade of healing in the organization because that love now finds some place to go. That suffering will be healed by that love that is now able to be expressed.
I love that. People want humanness and love and connection over polish and perfection and performance anyway. So very well put. Well, speaking of expressing love, Raj, I just love you to pieces. You're just one of my favorite human beings on the earth. And so I'm so glad that we were able to finally make this conversation work. I'm so eternally grateful to be your friend. I'm so eternally grateful to have been part of this journey of you writing this book and just everything about you and just thank you. Mwah.
Thank you, Rosie. Lots of love to you as well. I'm so grateful to have you in my life, and the world is a far better place because of Rosie Ward.
Thank you, Raj.
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.